Hey creeps, it's Horror Free for All. Continuing my passion project of a series that I affectionately call Gems from the Crypt, a series where we look at full-length feature films that feel like feature-length episodes of one of my favorite horror anthology shows ever made, Tales from the Crypt. Now, in this series, you're often going to see pretty spot-on comparisons to this thought, where they really do feel like just full-length feature episodes of that classic show. And then you're going to have some that just mostly capture the spirit of what made those stories work the way they did in that show. And for this film in particular, I think it's the latter more than the former. This film came out in 2009. It was written by Ivan and Sam Raimi, and it was directed by Sam Raimi. And the film in question is Drag Me to Hell. Now, Drag Me to Hell was a film that I caught on its opening weekend in 2009. I was in high school at the time, and kids my age loved to go see horror movies in a group setting, at least in the high school that I went to in my hometown in America. Now, this movie feels like a time capsule to that nostalgia I have for that time. And I can't really speak too earnestly on its flaws or any of that nature. I'm just going to admit that up front. But I will say, seeing this movie now as an adult completely makes me appreciate it in a whole new lens outside of nostalgia and just because it was a popular movie back when I was younger. To me, this movie feels like a perfect ode to EC Comics and its morality tales it often tried to share with its audience. Now, if you don't know anything about EC Comics, they were created by a fellow named William Gaines, who legit founded series like Crime Suspense Stories and Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and the list goes on within the EC Comics brand to legit just scare the fuck out of kids because he thought it would be cool and because it was popular with the kids. However, the comics were so controversial because they were being marketed to children with such mature subject matter that parents pretty much got together and filed a lawsuit and brought it to the United States government, who had to step in and pretty much put these guys on trial for misleading kids into buying adult content, which led to the controversial yet very important label that would change comics forever, going into what became known as the Silver Age of comics, and that is the Comics Code of Authority. This label meant that everything being marketed to kids from these big labels went through a filtration system and passed the test to get the seal. And if comics didn't have that seal and that approval, it was probably unsafe for your kids to be ingesting that material. Now, Drag Me to Hell, I don't know if it was made for this intention to be a love letter to EC Comics, or maybe it just so happened that Sam and Ivan Raimi have similar creative wavelengths of thought as William Gaines and the various people that made EC Comics the way it was. But what we got here as a whole film feels like a love letter to a bygone era of horror. And from time to time, especially in modern horror, you don't really feel like Tales from the Crypt is all that relevant anymore. I mean, as of recent, there was a movie that came out in 2024 that kind of felt like Tales from the Crypt called The Substance, that seemed to have people talking about the series again and wondering what kind of possibilities could be available moving forward, and possibly looking at EC Comics as a source of inspiration to reimagine some of these stories and make full-length features out of them. And if you're a very experienced horror reader, you will know that Drag Me to Hell kind of already did that before it was a popular thought these days. Drag Me to Hell sort of feels like stuff that you would see in EC Comics back in the day, or maybe in the Warren Creepy magazines, which were a more, I guess, mainstream polished version of what EC Comics were doing, but they came out in the 70s, way after the death of the original EC Comics run. And also, Drag Me to Hell weirdly feels like something straight out of Stephen King. As a matter of fact, if you've ever seen Stephen King's Thinner movie, which is based on a book that he wrote, I think, as Richard Bachman, which was a ghostwriter name, there's a lot of eerie similarities to that story and film, to this film in particular. But, of course, this film was made with the intention of being tied in some way to the Evil Dead franchise, a franchise which is much beloved by the average horror fan out there who loves watching horror movies. Now, Drag Me to Hell possibly is the most overlooked Sam Raimi film ever made. I think the most recent film that he's made that's still in buzz and still is talked about in a divisive manner is Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, which is his way of making a MCU Marvel movie with a twang of horror. Drag Me to Hell is almost a horror movie, almost a black comedy, almost a satire, but it weirdly works at everything it's trying to be at times. And honestly, for a PG-13 horror film, this has to be one of the best that I've seen ever given that rating distinction post-1990. With that out the way, let's talk about Drag Me to Hell. So, all you need to know is, in the beginning of the film, we are told in a flashback that took place, I think, in the 60s or 70s, of a boy who is perhaps being followed by some sinister entity. And the sinister entity likes to make itself known with a living fly being like a stowaway on the person's body. And the parents of this boy have brought this kid to a woman at this lavish house to perhaps cleanse him of this evil that has followed him and has polluted the home of this family. And while the boy is at this big house, the parents are having a squabble with this woman who might be a psychic or medium of some sort, and realizes that the boy is pretty much doomed, and the parents chillingly have to witness the boy get dragged to hell, which cuts into modern day. We meet the main character of the movie, Christine. Christine is played by Alison Lohman, who you might recognize from films like White Oleander. That's like the one film I think I ever saw her in outside of this. She is a loan officer at a bank in this unnamed city where she lives. She has a successful career. She has a bright future looking ahead of her in her personal life with her boyfriend, who's I think a college professor, and he's played by Justin Long. They have a really good relationship. She has basically everything that she can possibly want, but one thing that is bothering her is advancing in her career. Yeah, there are some struggles that she's going through, like meeting her boyfriend's parents for the first time, or maybe being estranged from her family, who are actually farmers that live out in the country, in the rural part of the state, or some other state somewhere that she's estranged from. But the main goal for her, outside of dealing with those things, is to alleviate the pressure on her job by getting promoted. Well, her coworker is also vying for the same position, and this raises the stakes for her, and she starts to ask questions to her boss what are her actual chances of getting the job. And her boss simply tells her, I want you to have the job, but I need to see improvement from you. And by improvement, I need you to make tough decisions, because if you can't do those things, you can't really be in the position I'm in. And almost as soon as she learns this, she's thrown into an opportunity to show her boss that she can make tough decisions in her current job that she's in. A immigrant woman comes in with disgusting fingernails, horrid looking dentures and a freaky looking eye. And she perhaps smells a little bad, has poor hygiene, but she is asking Alison Lohman's character for a third extension on a mortgage just so she can keep her home. And at first, she really wants to help this woman because, she looks nice, or at least she's behaving nice with her, and she has no real reason to be mean to this woman. But she's soon reminded of that position that she really wants and realizes that she's going to have to tell this woman no. And when she does so, the woman, of course, feels heartbroken, then feels grief, and then feels anger towards Alison Lohman's character. To the point where there's a ruckus and security is called and she's being escorted out of the building. And because she feels shamed in the situation and irate with anger, she tries to attack Alison Lohman's character. And this ultimately backfires and she's adequately thrown out of the bank. Once the situation is resolved, Alison Lohman's character finishes the rest of her shift and heads to her car in a nearby parking deck where she has a horrid encounter with this woman from before who perhaps is waiting inside of her car to ambush her and attack her again. After an over-the-top fight that results in a car crash and the woman just pretty much wrecking her car, there's one final interaction where the older woman gets an advantage over Alison Lohman and takes a piece of her clothing and seemingly does a ritual to it that chills Alison Lohman's character, and once that's over, the old woman disappears. We then get cut to a scene where the police is getting involved and she's trying to tell her story as best as possible, and unfortunately for the police, they don't know the whereabouts of the woman, and they're going to try their best to find out what happened to her. So, in the meantime, her boyfriend comes to pick her up, and they decide to, go back to his place and hang out for the night. And after they park the car, they're walking in a nearby area of a residential home of a psychic who has some advertisements outside of their house. And she seems compelled to want to go inside and speak to a psychic because almost immediately after this attack, she's having these weird feelings and she's hearing some noises and something seems really off in the situation. And when she goes to speak to this man, he at first is reluctant to want to help, but almost immediately after looking at her and speaking with her, he seems to be convinced that she perhaps is cursed. Now, the boyfriend seems to laugh it off, but Alison Lohman's character kind of listens to him and files into the back of her head, thinking that maybe her boyfriend's right, but perhaps maybe this psychic guy might be right too. And later that night, she has a horrific nightmare involving this old woman to the point where she wakes up in a cold pool of sweat. And now we see a fly, perhaps now following her. And it looks similar to what we saw with that little boy in the prologue of the story. Now, from this point on, this is where the story starts to get really bizarre. The next day, she has to go to work, but she has no car. So Alison Lohman's character gets a ride from her boyfriend to the bank. And the bank manager has heard what happened to her the night before, and he's shocked that she's there to work the next day. But she wants to prove that she's better than her coworker and does deserve this position. So she goes back to her loan officer desk and is seeing a new client. But when the client comes in, she's now being haunted by the older woman from before, which causes her to freak out. And there's another instance that happens, and we see an over-the-top depiction of her shooting blood out of her nose profusely and getting all over her boss. And she leaves the bank in a hurry and scurries off to her house. And while she's at home, it's kind of corroborated that there is some sort of curse in broad daylight, showing its ugly head to her. and she realizes very quickly that there's something completely wrong, and maybe this psychic guy was right and she was cursed. So she thinks that maybe, just maybe, there might be a way to make amends to this old woman that has placed a curse on her. So she goes to her residence to try to make amends. But when she goes there, she realizes in a fate of circumstance that maybe the old woman is dead now, and her family is there celebrating her life through her death. And she crashes the wake, let's just say, and there's something very over the top involving the corpse and her having close interaction. And this pisses off the old woman's family, and she's promptly thrown out. And that opportunity to make amends with the lady has now come and gone, and she's starting to feel a bit desperate. Now, from this point on, she then has to go to dinner with her boyfriend's family, and she has another interaction with a fly that seems to be following her around, and some more hallucinations while at dinner. And once she tries to clue her boyfriend in on what's going on, he seems to be growing more distant and questioning her sanity. And she feels like she's becoming increasingly alone on the situation, and this is something that she's going to possibly have to handle herself. So she goes back to the psychic to get some more help. And the psychic realizes that, yes, indeed, you are cursed, and I have some extra help that we can use at your disposal if you allow me to. And she gets introduced to the woman that we saw in the prologue, who assures her that she's been cursed by this demon who is summoned by gypsy women or gypsy people to drag people to hell after 3 days in succession of the day that they've been cursed. And since she's on, I think at this point of the story, day 2, the clock is ticking. So she's given an option, which is horrible, but she might have to sacrifice her own pet, which possibly doesn't work. And then from that point, once that doesn't work, she may have to hold a seance and get the demon to come out and into the body of a goat, where they can sacrifice the goat. And there's a whole over-the-top seance scene involving that as well. And then once that doesn't work, there's one third and final option that she has, and that is to take this piece of clothing that was taken from her and pawn it off to somebody else, which may or may not work as well. And this culminates into the final moment of the story before the ending, where she's had enough and the clock is ticking. And she has to get rid of this piece of clothing once and for all. She may or may not go to the graveyard where this woman is at, and we see in all of its over-the-top glory what becomes of that. Once she thinks that this ordeal is over, we're on the 3rd day since the curse was placed, and everything seems to be on the up and up. She gets to, go on this romantic getaway with her boyfriend, which seems to work out in her favor, and everything in life's looking good. But there's a twist that you might not see coming that pulls the rug out from under you. We find out exactly what happens to her. Off the bat, one thing I could say about this movie, like most other Sam Raimi movies, is that this movie is well directed. I think there are a lot of iconic looking scenes, and I don't expect anything less from the guy who made the original Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, the first 3 Sony Spider-Man movies. I mean, the list goes on. Sam Raimi's iconic. Even in his most recent film, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, his iconicness is on full display. I think that the atmosphere of this movie is very grounded in realism and feels very small scale, but expansive. You have, day-to-day living in apartments and homes, going to mundane jobs like banks, being in scary places like parking decks. And then you even have your over-the-top aspects to it, where you get to visit a psychic's house and a glorified huge mansion. And if you want to throw in some animal ritual stuff and that aesthetic to it, everything feels very pulp noir in its style and the atmosphere. And that is very refreshing to see in a modern horror movie. I think the acting performances in this film are mostly solid. I know Alison Lohman gets a lot of flack in her performance in this movie. It seems like people kind of are wish-washy with her, but I think she does a fine job. I love Justin Long just as much as I love Sam Raimi, so seeing him in this movie is always a welcome treat. And to be honest, if I haven't said it, the woman who places the curse on Alison Lohman's character is one of the creepiest things I have ever seen in a horror movie. Now, I've said it in the past, I'm not big on gore because I can laugh with gore. I can laugh with some monster schlock. But this woman is actual nightmare fuel, and I give them props for just making an old lady fucking creepy. And this goes to every scene that she's tied to in this movie. It's morbidly funny, over the top, gruesome, in one neat bow, and it's spectacular. Now, getting down to the story and the premise, this is where the true Tales from the Crypt nature of this story comes to shine. It has all the bells and whistles you can want out of a Tales from the Crypt story. If you want people getting a curse placed on them, you have it here. If you want a morally ambiguous main character going through a relatable struggle only to learn a painful but ironic, valuable lesson to their chagrin, you have it here. If you want twists and turns and over-the-top moments that are so absurd you're either forced to laugh or be scared, you have that here. And what I think you get in the ultimate package is kind of a big metaphor. I want to say it's the most thought out thing ever, but there is a metaphor talking about walking all over people to get what you want. Now, the main character, you can kind of look at her as an innocent girl that was just trying to do her job and didn't necessarily do anything wrong, because there was some legit motive to try to deny this older woman an extension on her mortgage. However, because she had to go against her true character and her true nature and become somebody that she's not, that act itself is something worthy of punishment. And this is the type of stuff that EC Comics would often come to scrutinize. You see, EC Comics, in a good amount of their stories that involve similar subject matter, have always pointed out that alternate personas, or pretending to be somebody you're not, is almost equally bad as lying. Because all you're doing is posing as something and fronting an exterior to people that make them think that that's who you really are, when you're not really that way. So when you come and try to apologize and rectify those things and convince them that you're not that way, it's hard to believe. And it makes it all more confusing, and it makes it all more harder to get behind you, because you can now see the empathy in the eyes of the person being lied to, and you don't necessarily blame them for not wanting to listen. And thus, if shitty things happen to you because of that, it's your own fault. And Drag Me to Hell is a very mean-spirited movie in all regards because of that realization. Now, if mean-spirited stories rub you the wrong way because you don't think people necessarily deserve these terrible things happening to them, welcome to Tales from the Crypt, where you have totally morally ambiguous characters left and right within this franchise that come out of the woodwork. And sometimes it's so hard for you to even sympathize with the main character, let alone want to like them. And sometimes it's easy to get behind them and want to root for them to get out of this situation, because you realize that everybody else around them look infinitely worse in comparison to them. If I actually had any negatives I can say about the film, and this is probably my strongest one I can provide here, it's simply for the fact that I feel like some of the over-the-top moments kind of went a bit too far. Yes, I said it, even though I love the old woman. Some of the stuff is just eerie, and then some of the stuff is outright what the fuck. And some scenes in particular I'm getting at here is the scene where The old woman has her dentures out as a cadaver, and Alison Lohman's character knocks over her casket inside of her home with all this old woman's family around. And the woman's teeth are just rubbing on the top of her nose. Why? And there's another scene. I can't remember if this is in the theatrical cut or the director's cut specifically. It might be in both. But there's a dream fake out where she has maggots being vomited into her mouth from this old woman. Why? Why? And there's also some little small things here and there. You know, there's a scene where Alison Lohman's in her room at her own place by herself, and these poltergeist activities start to act up, and it gets very weird. And then going to the seance scene with the goat, and the demon possessing the goat. What the fuck? Now I get it. This is a Sam Raimi movie. It's supposed to be goofy. Hell, if you've ever seen Evil Dead 2 or Army of Darkness, you might be shocked that I'm complaining about this. But I feel like for this specific movie, you didn't really need all those goofy moments. And I've seen the making of and the thought process behind this film from Sam Raimi, where he wanted to have some comedic moments to kind of counterbalance the scary moments here. And also, they were trying to go for a PG-13 audience, I think, from the get-go. So they inserted this stuff to be, hey, kids, look, you can laugh. I get it. But to me, this film, instead of being a smart, ingenious parody like Evil Dead 2 was of itself, Drag Me to Hell kind of got in the way of itself because it was trying to be too goofy at times when it just didn't need to be that. And that's really my only flaw with the film. Other than that, I think this film is a splendid treat that many people need to check out if you haven't seen it before. If I had to rate this movie from a 0 to 5 star basis, I'd probably give this movie an easy 4.5 out of 5 stars. With that being said, that's my thoughts on this film. Let me know how you feel about this movie in particular in the comment section if you'd like. And until next time, take care.